Welcome to the next episode of the Value Prop Show, Investing in APAC, brought to you by the Pacific Basin Economic Council. My name is Michael Walsh, CEO, as your usual host for today's episode. And my usual co-pilot and host, Miguel Aboitis, has left us to fly this one solo today, but he will be back for further episodes as we continue our journey around the APAC region, providing latest insights and investment opportunities from across the region for our members, partners, and followers. So today, New Zealand is the focus of our dialogue discussion, with a particular interest in their leading export industry, agribusiness. We hear from experts both based in New Zealand and in Hong Kong on the current challenges being faced and the innovation and collaboration that the current environment has fostered within this all-important sector. New Zealand leads the way for many others to take note of and follow, both from a practical solutions to policies that stimulate such innovation. With more and more countries announcing their commitments to net zero carbon economies by a certain date, it's focusing business leaders and policymakers to evaluate what still is left to be done. PBEC is all about meaningful business connections across the region, and sharing food is a traditional way of bringing people together. As this year's APEC 2021 is chaired by New Zealand, we felt it was important to highlight the host nation as part of our Value Prop series at the earliest opportunity. So I'm delighted we are joined in today's discussion by Rachel Talulali, CEO of Kona in New Zealand, an associated business of Wakatu Incorporation, who is also this year's chairperson of ABAC New Zealand 2021. That's APEC Business Advisory Council. Rachel has a tremendous and fabulous CV to date with numerous achievements to her name, such as being a former US Trade Commissioner and founder of the Yellow Brick Road Limited, a company that specializes in supplying quality seafood direct into restaurants throughout New Zealand. Rachel also received the Sir Peter Blake Leadership Award and is a member of the New Zealand Order of Merit for services to food and hospitality. She was named in 2018 Maori Woman Business Leader at the prestigious University of Auckland. But before we hear from Rachel, let me quickly introduce our other two guests on today's show. We also have joining us a leading expert in his field in KPMG's New Zealand Global Head of Agriculture and Partner Audit, Ian Proudfoot. Ian leads their consumer, industrial markets and agricultural lines of business. He provides audit and transaction services to clients in a wide range of sectors, including agribusiness, retail and distribution. And Ian joined from London and transferred to Auckland in 1996. And since that time, he has undertaken a diverse range of client assignments. And finally, Michael Kamalenko, Head of Government APAC for KPMG as well. Michael leads the government practice for KPMG in Asia Pacific and the infrastructure sector for KPMG in Hong Kong. His experience includes advising central and local governments, NGOs, investors, developers, and asset operators across a wide range of markets. Michael also specializes in advising clients on policy, projects, and transformation across the areas of public infrastructure, real estate, corporate finance, regulatory and economic reform, leadership development, and industry policy. He joined KPMG in 2014 in Melbourne and is currently based in Hong Kong. So to kick things off in conversation around agriculture and agribusiness, we agreed it would be fitting for Ian to provide us with some background to the sector and to set the scene, so to speak. How important is it to New Zealand's economy, and share his latest insights, both nationally and internationally, in regards to how the sector has fared despite COVID and the strict border restrictions that have and were imposed for prolonged periods. So we'll also look at trends towards more sustainable agricultural practices and data collecting. We'll then hear from Rachel and get an update, we hope, on ABAC's focus areas this year, namely people, place, and prosperity, amongst other things, before turning to the broader areas of geopolitics and policy alignment that are factors in a successful and speedy recovery within the sector and meeting some of those targets now being set across APAC. Before we end today's discussion, we'll also pick up the expert brains and where they see the growth opportunities for investors and entrepreneurs to take part in a sustainable future, given some of the social and climate challenges magnified by the pandemic and in parallel to the technological advances happening all around us. So with that, Ian, Over to you. The floor is yours. Thank you so much for joining.
Thanks very much, Michael, and thanks for the invite to join you this morning. So New Zealand, when you say how important is agribusiness and agri-food to New Zealand, it is critical. And I suppose what the pandemic has highlighted is the criticality of this sector to our economy. You know, we're quite an unusual developed country in that we generate, but if you look at February's numbers, about 78% of our export returns from traded exports come from what we grow and sell to the world, so our agri-food products. It's a very big part of our economy, about $46 billion worth of exports in the last 12 months. So, you know, where we sit, this sector is, for us, it's how we pay for, it's how we create a wealth, it's how we pay for our schools, pay for our roads, pay for our hospitals. It's what creates the economic value in New Zealand. And at this period at the moment where we obviously can't get people across our border, our other key external revenue source is tourism, and that's not there currently. So this is even more important than it has been historically. If you look at our food and fibre sector, we can produce food to feed around about 40 million people, their full nutritional diet. What we often talk about in New Zealand is, you know, actually, how should we be thinking about those 40 million people? Are we trying to feed 40 million people solely, or are we trying to spread that across a much wider group of people, but provide only a small part of their diet? And I suppose as a nation, we talk a lot about moving from volume to value, and that's been a strong area of conversation now, probably for the last 10 years. And we've made big progress in that area. If you look across our dairy sector, for instance, our estimates suggest that of our dairy revenues now, about 3 billion of them have come from value growth over the last sort of 7 or 8 years. So significant uplift in that area. But can we go further? And I think most people, when you look across our spectrum of what we grow and export, we export dairy, we export red meat products, particularly beef and lamb. We export kiwi fruit and apples, so a range of horticulture products, as well as some vegetables. Wine's a significant export category for us now and growing significantly. Honey obviously is very important, and seafood. So we work across a broad spectrum of what I would suggest are premium food products. The other key part of our industry in terms of the fibre is wool and forestry products, and they between them make up around $6 billion worth of exports. So where are we at, and what does that look like? Well, the last 12 months have been really quite challenging. You know, the pandemic has connected people to food very much so. And the sector was categorized quite early on in the process of the lockdowns that we had here in New Zealand as an essential industry. So the food and fibre sectors have been able to largely trade through, not completely, and there's definitely been some quite significant restrictions on operations, but have been able to trade through. So where are they sitting today? Well, when we analyse the sector, the thing that comes up firstly, and I'm sure Rachel will touch on this as well, is some of the supply chain challenges that organisations are facing. It is becoming incredibly difficult to get a product out of New Zealand to a customer on time. I think if you go back 2 years, in 2019, we had about 85% reliability of supply chain. That's probably now sitting about 35%. So that's a big challenge for a lot of organizations. The good thing is we're still seeing plenty of demand, so that's not costing us sales, but it is making it hard to complete those sales and significantly more expensive. And that increase in cost in supply chain is something we don't see going away very quickly. So it is causing people to rethink and think about, you know, what does the investment profile look like? Where are you going to do the value add activities? Do we do them here in New Zealand, or do we do them offshore? Second challenge facing a lot of organizations is availability of talent. We just, you know, the borders have closed. This industry has relied heavily on what I would call transient labor. So either people coming to New Zealand to work in a specific role, or people passing through New Zealand that spend a season here and pick fruit or do pruning. We've had a very significant project with the Pacific Islands, so what we call the RSE program, or the Recognised Seasonal Employer program. And that's been a great way of both creating work for people in the islands, but also transferring, significant amounts of money back into the islands. So many would consider it sort of our most effective international development project. We would normally get between 11 and 12,000 RSE workers into the country. This year, we've been able to get 2,000 across the border. So that's had a significant impact as well on the industry. And I suppose what that's driving is a conversation about what can we automate, what needs to be done by people, and how do we use people in the way most effectively to help us create premiums for the products we're producing. But I expect to see the platform for change around bringing innovation into our agriculture sector, around automating a lot of jobs that have been done historically very manually, is going to accelerate. Next key theme that's definitely high on the agenda for most of our organizations relates to the environment. And I suppose there's various components to that conversation. Probably the big conversation from a New Zealand domestic perspective is around the quality of our water. So what impacts does agriculture have on water? And I think as a country, we have an aspiration to move towards swimmable water and do that as quickly as possible. But obviously that creates some significant challenges that are being addressed at the moment, and creating some potential inequities between different groups within the industries. Climate's a major challenge. This New Zealand has entered into an act, Zero Carbon Act, which requires us to move towards zero carbon by 2050. So that's no longer something that's a conversation here. It is now something that's a legislated requirement for us to move in that direction. The challenge obviously is, what speed do we move in that direction, and how do we enable ourselves to do that in the most effective way that creates both economic value for us, as well as enabling us to ensure that we're meeting our international obligations to create an equitable and fair transition towards a lower carbon future. And then the other key area, I suppose, when you talk about the environment is around our biodiversity. And I think the conversations that are starting internationally around things like Task Force for Nature-related financial disclosures are going to be very, very topical and very relevant in New Zealand, where I suppose as a country that relies on our natural environment for our two major sources of income, both food and fibre and tourism, how we think about and preserve and protect our nature-based assets and nature-based tonga is something that's very high on the agenda. And from a government's perspective, they've come out and put out a program called Fit for a Better World, which is an aspirational vision for New Zealand to move towards becoming a more regenerative, but not regenerative in a passive sense, but regenerative in a technologically enabled sense, in a way that we're trying to work with the world's most discerning customers to produce the best food, and as a consequence create more value from our sector, but also ensure that our environment, our natural environment, is being appropriately protected, be they our soils, our forests, our oceans, or any part of that natural environment. A lot of what I've talked about keeps coming back to a theme around digitalisation, and that's a global theme. We're seeing significant trend towards globalisation, and from New Zealand's perspective, we've taken a position where there is now a government strategy to enable us to accelerate our agri-tech sector, so what's called an industry transformation plan. And that's an area of key focus for us now, and I suppose we're looking at where we can build international partnerships to enable us to progress more effectively in that area. But if you move beyond, there's also a live debate, and I think it's going to become a very hot debate around the role of genetic technologies in New Zealand's future. We've had a fairly clear, bright line against genetically modified organisms. Gene editing is starting to raise some questions as to whether that's the right place, as well as some broader international ethical questions about how these technologies can help us achieve things like climate change. So I see that as a discussion that's going to evolve. And then if you take the other issue that it's really crosses very strongly with what we're seeing on a global basis, is the role of our food system and ensuring that we've got equity of access. During COVID, we saw about 1 million people being unable to access the sufficient food to enable them to maintain a quality of life that we would expect them to have. So even a relatively small country that produces a lot of food, that food access issue is becoming far more important. And from my perspective, when I look at that inequality of access issue, whether it's here in New Zealand or anywhere around the world, you're either part of the solution or you're part of the problem. And I think for our food industry, they've now got to do quite a lot of thinking as to how they become part of the solution. When you place us in a global environment, there's a lot happening internationally, and I think clearly for us at the moment, the role of geopolitics is very important. How do we keep walking that fine tightrope between our traditional allies, the Five Eyes network, for instance, and I suppose our key customers, which is particularly China. And that means as a small country that we've got to be very open to working with both sides and keeping ourselves very nimble and very agile through that journey. We see big opportunities in health for the food system globally, and we see therefore for New Zealand that creates a big opportunity as we produce sustainable food. But we've got to do better in terms of our own health outcomes. So we've got to turn our minds to how we address some of the challenges that we have. But personally, I think from a food system perspective, what the pandemic's done is it's highlighted the importance of preventing yourself getting sick rather than trying to cure you when you are sick. And food is so important to that preventative healthcare prescription. But I think we'll see a transformation globally around food in the health system. I've already touched on trade. I'm not going to say too much more about it, but the global trade system is as challenging as the New Zealand specific interaction with that trade system. And I think, what that's driving towards, and when I look globally, is governments thinking about how do we ensure we've got domestic food resilience. And, that's going to create challenges as to whether people continue to work within a rules-based open trading system that we as a small trading nation have relied so heavily upon. So I think there's a big piece around what the future of the global trade system is going to look like. I won't touch on it too long, but I think data sovereignty is really important. And what we saw a few weeks back in Australia when Facebook pulled out or cut off the news feeds is just one indicator, I think, of what we are going to see. We're seeing governments and international companies recognize that data is incredibly valuable. In fact, it's an asset of national security, that level of significance. So how do countries draw borders around their data to protect it? And yet we as a small food producer that needs access to as much information as possible is just trying to work out how we can source all that information. So I think, depending on how we see an evolution of data boundaries, we will see how the digital economy evolves. I think what we do know is we've got to be really smart in making sure we're very clear on why we want access to data. And then I think the other global theme that ties very much with what we're seeing here in New Zealand is around an equitable transition to a lower carbon future. And that is going to be something I think that's going to create some really interesting challenges. Are we going to see carbon being used as a non-tariff barrier where it starts to be raised as to, what's your carbon footprint where you can't come across the border? Are we going to start to see carbon taxes being implemented at the border if your footprint's not right? How's that going to play out? And, how are we going to ensure that this alignment of countries towards wanting to see a zero carbon future is actually going to be done in a way that's positive rather than being used against countries? So there's a lot of issues in the air at the moment. I think the agri sector, though, is one that's probably been quite slow to come into the mainstream. We all eat food, but it's been taken for granted. I think what the last 12 months has done is really taken food from the granted category into one where people are recognizing that there is a lot that underlies the food they eat. And that's a huge opportunity for the food system globally, as I see it. That's probably some introductory comments.
Thanks, Ian. A lot covered there as always, but that's always good because it gives everybody the food for thought, forgive the pun. So I want to bring in Rachel now. Obviously, Rachel, as we spoke before in preparation for this, you wear several hats on a daily basis besides your daily business. Maybe give us a bit of a taste of a day in the life that you're currently experiencing, albeit mainly, I guess, on Zoom internationally with some of your international commitments, but just from a domestic perspective as well. Thanks.
Sure, tēnā koutou katoa, and thank you very much for the opportunity to take part in the conversation today. And yes, I do wear a number of hats, like many of us. And a day in the life It's probably much more dull than you imagine, to be honest. It's a little bit of this at the moment, and a little bit of phone action. But really, there's a heck of a lot of work going on through ABAC at the moment. We are about to embark on ABAC 2. We usually have 4 in-person meetings a year. We've obviously transitioned those into being a digital gathering, and it's not 4 times a year. We have 5 working groups and 16 task forces, so there are meetings every day, if not several times a day, but there are 4 main ABAC meetings that are put together. So that's busy. The work with our customers keeps us busy, and it's really great to be involved with the topic today, a COVID recovery, because it's one that certainly keeps me up at night, not just as CEO of a Māori or Indigenous food and beverage company, but also in one that's largely involved in export. About 85% of our produce finds its way into the world, but also, of course, as the chair for this year's APEC Business Advisory Council. Here in New Zealand, we have, of course, the luxury of being able to contemplate economic recovery, largely without having to deal with the brutal health impacts of COVID. And that certainly never goes unnoticed. But of course, we can't quarantine ourselves from the world and from the pandemic's broader economic effects. To its huge credit, the agribusiness sector delivered really strong performance last year, and in some cases like dairy, wine or fruit, it's actually one of our better years yet. But last year's success doesn't mean job done, and I'm personally concerned about a number of factors, which I'll perhaps take the time to go through and touch on now. The first, sustained growth depends on the good health of our markets, but the economic recovery of many of our trading partners, especially in Europe and North America, risk being derailed by the ongoing threats of the virus. More broadly, the fact is that nobody is safe until everybody is safe, and the WHO has pointed out the pandemic is accelerating. The vaccine nationalism and restrictions on trade in essential medical goods really puts us in serious jeopardy. What's worse is that COVID has only exacerbated what we have already seen over the last few years in terms of trade tensions and rising protectionism around the world. Since the GFC, there have been nearly 2,000 trade restrictive new measures like subsidies and tariffs. And a recent study by Sense Partners here in New Zealand has found that Asia-Pacific countries introduced nearly 24 new non-tariff barriers on food products last year. And while some of those restrictions have subsequently been removed, about 1/3 of those remains. We also face impacts of climate change, as has been alluded to by Ian, and the technological transformation. Now, of course, disruption can generate new opportunities as well as risks, but at the very least, the evolving environment will take careful navigation as we move forward. As we still face the long-standing blight of the exclusion of too many in our communities from the benefits of trade, including those potential new opportunities created by digital. So I guess, Michael, to put it another way around, there are challenges abound, and top of my mind, as I said, is thinking about what the answer might be. In my view, achieving a resilient recovery for New Zealand requires keeping markets open, keeping trade costs down, and helping to support the economic recovery around the region in our own interests. And that really does bring me to ABAC. ABAC has always been a champion of sustainable and inclusive growth and deeper regional economic integration. As this year's ABAC chair, those fundamental aspirations are as relevant as ever, and our theme this year is people, place and prosperity, as you mentioned earlier, o tangata, taio me te taurikura and te reo Māori. So of those, people are at the heart of our goals. We can't achieve any of our aspirations for the region if people are focused on whether they will have enough food to feed their children. Food security is the starting point for everything else, and I know Ian also spoke of that, and that means that we need food systems, including food trade, to function well. More broadly, we need to ensure that all people have the opportunity to share in the benefits of trade. Taking active steps to achieve greater inclusion is critical, whether it's for Māori or other Indigenous producers, women or small businesses. Equally, when it comes to our second element, which is place, if we don't take deliberate action to embrace and accelerate the transition to a low carbon economy, including for food systems, we cannot safeguard the future of our planet. And lastly, we won't achieve long-term prosperity unless exporters can trade on a fair footing into open markets and with minimal tariff and non-tariff barriers, with functional supply chains and efficient and probably digitalized trade processes. And because there's always more, to do so in an environment where the domestic economy settings are fit for purpose. So the question that usually comes my way is, how is ABAC working towards delivering those goals? And if I can just, as an overarching comment, say that ABAC's job is to make recommendations to APEC leaders about what is needed, but with a business voice. In a month's time, we'll be meeting with APEC trade ministers. Later in the year, we will meet with ministers, other than the trade ministers, to talk variously about structural reform, food security, women's economic empowerment, and the finance agenda. And in November, we meet with APEC leaders and present them with a detailed report that covers the whole waterfront. In those conversations, ABAC will emphasise first and foremost the way that we can use trade levers to help get everyone vaccinated. This is obviously about health, but it's also about enabling borders to open again in a safe way, which is crucial to helping kickstart economic recovery. For those of us at the front line of exporting, we also clearly need more regional coordination on supply chains, as Ian has referenced as his first challenge. They continue to be enormously disrupted, and we need action to stamp out those non-tariff barriers that I mentioned earlier. Those steps make trade easier and less costly. Another important part of that effort is leveraging digital technologies. We need to try and make sure that digital trade can operate as seamlessly as possible across borders. So for our sector, things like wider acceptance of e-certificates or a favourable regulatory environment so that we can use blockchain for supply chain and traceability. In addition, helping small businesses to build the digital skills they need makes really good sense. And of course, we need good trade architecture to underpin a sustained economic recovery, because ABAC remains a staunch advocate for a reformed and credible WTO. Incredible in this instance means actually doing something about cutting trade distorting agriculture subsidies and the subsidies that encourage overfishing, and focusing on other ways that trade reform can support good environmental outcomes in keeping with our role as kaitiaki, or custodian of our planet. In fact, when it comes to the environment more broadly, this is a critical element for New Zealand's year, and one of our goals as chair will be to develop principles for business leadership on climate change that can be adopted across the region. Longer term, and coming to a close, ABAC is a strong champion for a more economically integrated region and for an eventual free trade area of the Asia Pacific, or FTAP, which would open up the whole of the Asia Pacific region to seamless and dynamic growth. One of my personal goals for this year is to ensure that we work to foster an Indigenous economic success, and that we take a rightful place in the APEC agenda, and that the Indigenous economies form part of our work and inclusion alongside our goals for women's economic empowerment. We need to create opportunities for all, and the concept of equity is foundational really to the kind of societies we want to live in, but it makes good economic sense too, especially as we're trying to revitalise across the region. Finally, to the agri-food sector itself, and I appreciate I've probably given you a lot of information at a broad level, but for the agri-food sector itself, one of APEC's big deliverables this year will be a roadmap for food security through to 2030. And ABAC will be closely involved in co-designing this. We'll be arguing for a whole of system approach in which all parts of the value chain from pasture to plate operate seamlessly together, and in a way that achieves sustainability, taking into account water, soil, carbon and waste. Using interoperable digital tools, whether we're talking about agri-tech standards, to traceability, to digital logistics, to e-commerce, as a part of both product integrity and, of course, lower cost. And finally, food trade is crucial for both food security and rural jobs in the community. So in short, it really is a pretty gargantuan and ambitious agenda, but for better or worse, COVID really does make it an imperative. Kia ora.
That's wonderful, Rachel, and it's inspiring actually to hear that ABAC is actually doing more than usual. I guess is with you as the chair. I'm sure it's because of your passion. It's a big undertaking. It's such a big agenda, and I think for those, I mean, a lot of our listeners understands and you know what ABAC and APEC is about. But then there's others who are listening in and maybe never heard of them before. And I just want to re-emphasize, it's kind of like the silent majority of the leaders getting involved in very important advisory position. You know, we have the KPMGs on the line today, but actually this is advisory coming from business leaders themselves saying, these are some of the things that we need to look at and address. And then that gets fed up through the various systems to finance ministers, as you mentioned, economic ministers who ABAC gets to meet. And just to be clear, ABAC and APEC do not form policy, but just advise how policies can be constructed. And typically there's a very high percentage of success in that methodology by consensus. So I want to bring in Michael now, because it's important. You know, we've heard a lot now about New Zealand in particular and the agricultural business, but just now taking a more broader view regionally, because obviously APEC covers 21 member states around the region. And your lens, Michael, from Hong Kong, and you know your background from Australia, you've got a great pulse, if you like, on what governments are thinking. So I'd like to hear your views. Thanks, Michael.
Thanks, Michael. Good morning, and thanks to you and PBEC for having me, and good afternoon to Rachel and Ian, and some wonderful insights there and food for thought, as Michael said earlier. So maybe I'll start at the global level and talk about some of the geopolitics we've seen over the past 12 plus months. So as we all know, 2020 and 2021 has been incredibly volatile, driven by COVID-19. And we've seen a tragic health toll. I think we're at about 152 million cases and around 3.2 million deaths globally, you know, nothing short of tragic. And we've seen huge economic carnage as well. So 2020, the numbers I've seen with the global output, GDP output, was down about 4.3%. So real challenges on the health front and on the economic front globally. And governments are under huge pressure to address these challenges. Of course, we've seen mass economic stimulus being pumped into economies globally and in our region. And we've seen, of course, a huge healthcare response as well in more recent times with the rollout of vaccines into markets around the world. But both of these measures, the economic measures and the healthcare measures, take time. They take time to reach the desired outcomes that everybody hopes and wants them to. So what that does in the meantime, as I said, it puts politicians, it puts policymakers under a lot of pressure to deliver wins to their communities and their societies. And that's at a time when we've had COVID-19 bubbling along. And so what you've seen there, you know, governments haven't been able to respond with the traditional, rational, economic and social responses. So you've seen actually a lot more negative rhetoric. You know, you've seen a global blame game around COVID-19. You've seen, you know, strong border closures to certain peoples and certain nations, and diverging quarantine arrangements from one country to the next, with differences between how certain people from other nations are treated. So all of that has led to more global tension, and what that is also doing is it's playing out in the global media. Right, so you're not just the global media, but also in social media. So you're seeing conflicts on the street, you're seeing greater protests, and in some cases levels of violence as well, all around these core issues, right? And when we think to the Asia-Pacific region, it's no different, right? And the agribusiness sector has actually been caught right in the middle of a lot of these global dynamics. So to give you an example, Australia, as an Australian in Hong Kong. I've seen both sides of the Australia-China tension that's been in the playing out over the past 12 plus months. In the agriculture space, we've seen tariffs and restrictions placed on products such as barley, beef, wine, and lobsters coming out of Australia into China, and that's caused a lot of media. Right, you've seen a lot of rhetoric around that, a lot of sensationalism about the impact that those actions are having on the trade relationship between Australia and China, but it's also leading to some social tensions in those communities as well, amongst those different ethnic groups. And as a result, some people are asking the question: is Australia and China's trade future fractured, and is it repairable? And these are big questions to be asking. But if you look at the reality, Australia-China exports are actually only down 2% when compared to pre-pandemic levels. So not massive in the global or the Australian scheme of export things, but what it does create a question mark around is the perception, does that become the reality? So despite the small change in numbers, what does that mean going forward? And what it does mean is it's an opportunity for other nations to build a stronger relationship with China, particularly around agricultural products, and fill that gap, that near-term gap, that relationship gap, and that export gap. So if you think about some of the winners from those dynamics in the near term, clearly, Ian and Rachel would I'm sure agree, but New Zealand, with their beef, with their red meats, with their wines, there's been an opportunity there for New Zealand. Markets such as Chile and Argentina as well, known wine producers as well, being able to tap into the opportunity there. And then if you think about the seafood opportunity, the various ASEAN markets that are, have strong capabilities in fisheries. So there's a lot of opportunity there in this tension and dynamic that you're seeing play out. But if we look to the future, the question is, are those tensions going to continue? Are we going to get back to some sort of more stable environment, both Australia, China, but also just more regionally? I think the question or the answer to that depends on global levels of volatility. As I said, we've been in a hugely volatile, experienced a hugely volatile period of time. And if that continues, one would expect that there could be more tension coming through, and who knows what that could lead to. But at the same time, we are starting to see some shoots of economic recovery. There are predictions that 2021 could see, at a global level, all of that output that was lost in 2020 recovered, and possibly then some. So as the global economy starts to recover, as the vaccine rollout starts to take hold more and more, what you'll see is, at a global level and at a regional level, governments trying to tap into that economic opportunity, that growth recovery. That people talk about the K-shaped recovery, either being on the upside or the downside. And you can be sure that policymakers and politicians will want to be on the upside of that. So being able to capture that will come back to restoring relations, opening up trade channels, healing some of the conflicts and wounds that have been developed over the past year to 18 months, and looking forward to getting back to some sort of fast recovery. I think as part of that, the underlying drivers will return to more rational economic focus areas. So things like jobs, things like paying down debts that we've seen come through during the pandemic. A lot of governments have taken on large amounts of debt to fund the different stimulus packages, and of course, generating taxes as part of that, and ultimately GDP growth. So I think there are some positives that could be around the corner, but again, it depends on some of this global volatility simmering down. If I think about future opportunities for agribusiness coming out of all of this, what we've seen in the past year to 18 months, and Ian touched on this, is challenges around supply chain resilience. And so that's made a lot of governments stand up and take notice about how do they protect food security to make sure that people can be fed, and quality of livelihood can continue to be strong and grow. So I think what we're going to see, and it also comes back to some of the stuff that Ian and Rachel were talking about around technology and digitization, but I think you'll see advances around agribusiness both at a city level and at a farm and distribution level. So at a city level, this drive for smart cities is something that has been, in every newspaper and every day, right? We hear about this all the time, and I think there will be a role for agribusiness in that. One particular area is around controlled environmental agriculture. So actually moving some of the food production into cities, into the built environment. So decentralizing and actually offering it, in built structures. So I think one thing that will come through in the next economic cycle is city governments and provincial governments planning cities around with an element of controlled environmental agriculture in the way buildings are designed and developed. So, in our region in particular, new city development is a huge trend. There are countries right around the region are looking to either build new cities or expand existing cities with smart technologies being at the heart of that. So Hong Kong has plans for a new CBD and city development in coming years. In China, there are, mainland China, there are many cities and new cities in the works. The Philippines has plans as well to build satellite cities around Manila, for example. And Indonesia as well has plans for new city growth. So I think those markets you'll start to see, or the more progressive city governments will start to embrace controlled environmental agriculture as a means of providing an element of supply chain resilience. It's not going to change and eliminate the need for farms. Clearly they're there and they're here to stay, but I think it'll provide a new dimension, and you'll hear more noise about this and more activity in the coming years. The other one is around the farm and distribution, and I think you'll see opportunities around automation, looking to take cost out of farming, as Rachel touched upon, to make it more efficient, but also to take cost out of the distribution, the distribution chain, and also speed the timeframes from farm to plate, right? So taking cost out, taking time out. And automation, data, and digital has to be a big part of that. So I think you'll see the agribusiness sector, take big strides forward in those areas, and that creates opportunities for startups, for entrepreneurs, and more mature businesses to actually develop that technology and generate returns to investors. So, Michael, some tough dynamics that we're dealing with at the moment, but I think actually we're at the beginning of a much more positive stretch of time and the beginning of a new cycle, but we've still got to get ourselves out of the woods first.
Yeah,
thanks, Michael.
Well, no, thank you, Michael. And again, some really interesting points there. Obviously, every country has its own needs right now, and maybe behaving selfishly, as you've touched upon, for the right reasons, I guess, in the short term. But we hope as things start to improve. But right now, it does feel like, especially in Asia, that we have to be very cautious. And certainly some of the developing countries where COVID seems to be re-emerging, where they had it pretty much under control, like places even like Vietnam and Thailand, which is worrying, both big farming countries in their own right in exports. But I want to come back to Ian quickly, because you touched upon in our conversation in the lead up to this about IP, intellectual property, and the potential opportunity to export this from a New Zealand perspective, best in class, best in practice. Could you just go into a little bit more about how can you monetize that?
It's interesting with what Michael's just said around, how controlled agriculture might find its way into new city development, for instance, or into new construction in existing cities. If you think about the challenges we're facing on supply chain and the uncertainties that are inherent in that at the moment, and an expectation that costs are going to be higher moving forward, plus the challenges Rachel alluded to in terms of the challenges to our traditional rules-based trading system. One option you may start to see companies here in New Zealand or in other places that are on natural exporters start to think about is actually, rather than export the hard product, how do we export the IP that underlies that product? So how can we use our PVRs that we have around a particular fruit? How do we connect that with an algorithm that can give us, say, coming out of Rachel's region, the Nelson climate in a controlled cropping system? And how can we connect that with the brand that we've already invested heavily in building around the world and packaging up? So rather than selling the product, you sell a turnkey solution to somebody developing a controlled cropping system in a new city. And rather than send the product, you generate a return from licensing that way of working. Could that be a model we start to see? I think it could very much be on their cards. The amount of uncertainty that's existing at the moment creates that as a real opportunity.
And Rachel, because obviously you're in the weeds there in New Zealand in terms of the market itself. I mean, are you seeing an increase from your colleagues in the industry in purchasing equipment, upgrading, starting, if you like, that digitalized pathway? We talk about it, we hear a lot about it, but in reality, it's a slow step-by-step process. You can't do it overnight. There's costs involved, there's retraining involved. Can you maybe just share a little bit of what you're seeing there? You know, has COVID accelerated people's attention to upgrade and change?
I think to be fair, it's probably sharpened everyone's senses. I think we already believed ourselves to be in great need of a focus on better productivity as a country. You know, we're smart cookies, but our productivity levels are amongst the worst in the OECD. And so with that in mind, I think that there's predating COVID, there was a heck of a lot of motivation and opportunity for us to improve our perspective in and around automation. And a lot of that for me, certainly came into focus through the COVID period, but the future of work is not a new idea. And so I think that it's been something that we should have been thinking about quite keenly for some time. But as I say, we probably had that brought into a different degree of focus during COVID. It should, in fact, lead us down more tracks, the sorts of places that Ian has alluded to in and around IP. Now that's a tough one because IP is expensive, and it takes a long time to develop, and it's very costly to protect. So in and of itself, it almost excludes, or at least it'll create a bit of a gap, I think, between a lot of our MSMEs and the rest of the country's businesses. But then equally, a lot of our best ideas come out of those MSMEs. And so how do you get that really great energy and intellect and idea and work with those small to medium-sized companies to scale them up and help them protect that without taking it away from them? So it's a bit of might turn into a bit of a power share for the nation good.
And just to keep you on point there, you know, as chair of ABAC 2021, I mean, I sort of, as an observer, having an Irish background, typically we're seen as the guys who sit on the fence in any political dispute. But New Zealand also, from a regional perspective, it was touched upon earlier that you're able to, or you need to be nimble and sensitive to keeping your largest, you know, export market in China on board with some of the other large export markets of Europe and America with all the geopolitics background. I'm just wondering, you know, come November as chair, do you see, you know, the thing that normally gets signed up, you know, typically at the end of a year of APEC, where China and US come together, brokered by New Zealand, signing up to something that's environmentally focused rather than anything else?
You know, where you just cut out just in the middle of your question there. I'm so sorry I didn't hear that, but I'm interested in your comment about brokered by New Zealand, because I will say that in my experience, it has been a great experience being involved, sitting between these two, you know, great economies and bringing together what were up until a few months ago quite disparate views on a number of levels, but we seem that we're watching those come back together, and you can't make that go any faster than it is presently. You can simply, I think, be sensitive to the fact of their responsibilities and perspectives that are having to be changed. And as I think maybe I've written somewhere recently, you know, it's a marathon, not a sprint. And so pretty lofty goals, but look, I've had a great degree of consensus as to what we think leaders should be considering that is of interest to business. I don't have any doubt that we're going to get to a really positive position in that sense.
Yeah. Okay. And so I wanted to just touch then upon, you know, just ask all three of you, maybe starting with Michael, is where would you invest $10,000 US if you had it spare in your pocket right now within the agribusiness sector? Where would you put your $10,000 for the highest return?
Put me on the spot, hey. So that, I think maybe just to sort of give myself a little bit of time to think through that. But one stat I'll share with you is that globally through the pandemic, you know, consumer savings, incremental consumer savings, there's an additional, according to Bloomberg, US $3 trillion in savings out there, right? So there's a lot of money sitting on the sidelines that I believe will go into different forms of expenditure and investment coming out of the pandemic and helping support greater economic growth. So I think with that sort of, and by the way, 2/3 of that money is sitting in the US and China, right? So hugely important to the world's global economic recovery, those two markets. So coming back to your question, I think actually it is a good time to be thinking about investing, because there's a lot of money sitting on the sidelines that's going to follow into the market as the recovery takes off. So if you ask me where would I be investing personally, if I was looking at agribusiness, it would be around companies that have a niche in data, right? So whether it be being able to assess the quality of produce using data and analytics tools, or whether it be tools that allow the supply chain to be streamlined and time taken out, and being able to choose distribution options that are cost effective and low risk, or indeed planning tools, as I mentioned earlier, for city governments that help them introduce different forms of controlled environment agriculture into their cities. I think will be something that escalate or accelerate in demand. So I think there'll be opportunities across the supply chain. I don't think it's necessarily going to be in one area stronger than another. But I do think actually, to your question, it is a good time to be thinking about investing in this space. So hopefully that gives you enough food for thought, Michael.
Well done for being put on the spot and coming out with that. Ian, anything to add to that? I mean, we hear about ETFs, exchange trade funds, in broader terms for agriculture. Is that something some of your clients are looking at?
There's some of those coming, and they provide the benefits that you can be in a number of different ecosystems and climates and product categories and balance risk. And one of the reasons people haven't invested in agriculture is it is inherent. It's a 7-year cycle. There's always going to be a bad year, and we haven't done anything to overcome that biological challenge that the industry has. And that's, I think, what's happening is people are learning to accept that and seeing through in terms of looking at the longer term cycles. But if I was putting 10K in now, digital would definitely be one area that I'd be thinking about. The other one would be into food as health. And I think, this growing recognition that people have that what you put into your body influences what comes out of your body. How can you invest in either some of the technologies around prescription-based food, DNA-based diets, or actually just investing into some of these emerging food opportunities that are really focused on the nutrient density of the product. And I think that would be a pretty good place to be looking at an investment.
Thanks, Ian. And Rachel, not to be on the spot about your $10,000, but because you have to be mindful of time as well, but I just wanted to finish where you did bring up principles for business leaders that you're going to be developing at ABAC in relation to the environment, I guess, and sort of sustainable practices. Would that be tied in along the lines of a typical ESG, environmental social governance type standard, sort of linking it to some of the themes that are already coming out in sort of stock market of Hong Kong, Singapore, the Nikkei? Is it going to be along those lines, sort of an inclusive list of principles?
Yeah, I can't believe I didn't get to bet $10,000. I was totally cheated there, but I'm just going to tell you where I'd put it.
Please do.
Project around information and data, like Michael would have. So I'm going to use that technology. It's going to be digitized, but it's going to address community food sovereignty, because one of the things I think we've seen in the last 18 months is that idea of people need to feel safe. They need to have sovereignty over their own food supply, and then they can regenerate systems that support that. And they've been forced into that, but it's actually an age-old idea. So particularly for Indigenous economies, that safety, sovereignty, regeneration loop is something they're very used to. So anyway, that's where my money's going. In answer to your principles for climate leadership, look, they take their direction from the Climate Leaders Coalition here in New Zealand. And I think that climate is a particularly challenging subject on the APAC agenda. Not every economy has a similar relationship to the ideas of climate leadership as we might. And so I think, though, economies and representatives of economies have a similar outcome in mind, how people get to those is wholly different, and the pace at which they get to those is wholly different. And so what we're trying to do through the principles of leadership is to say, if this is the end goal, how might we behave in order to get from 1 through 10 to that point. And look, the more invested you are, or the more motivated you are, the more quickly you'll reach that point. But here are the things that need to happen along the way. So it is about behaviors. It does naturally speak to ESG, but it leaves economies with room to, to have those principles manifest themselves in a way that's appropriate to the economy.
Wonderful. Well, I think we're going to have to leave it there because we're running out of time. And it's always the case where we've got so many fantastic areas that was brought up today, and we could literally have separate dialogues in each one of them, to be honest. Especially the future of work is another big area that Rachel touched upon. So just want to thank all my guests today, Michael, Ian and Rachel, for joining us from wherever you are. It's, the powers of Zoom over the last sort of 2 years and other platforms. I'm not just promoting Zoom here, but, Teams and all the others. It's amazing how we can come together and share some of these dialogues where before we were probably spending too much carbon in the air traveling to have these conversations around an enjoyable lunch. But I do hope I can do that regardless on a personal level and come to New Zealand, because it's one of the countries I would love to visit before too long. So with that, the Value Prop Show is brought to you by PBEC, and a special thanks to KPMG ASPAC, who have been supporting this effort today on New Zealand. So with that, thank you for listening and see you next time. Bye-bye.
The Value Prop Show is brought to you by PBEC, the Pacific Basin Economic Council. Your co-hosts are Miguel Aboites and Michael Walsh from PBEC. You can follow us and subscribe on our LinkedIn, YouTube, and Twitter. Thanks for watching and listening, and see you in the next episode.